The beginning of a dream. Olivia Wells stepped into the sleek, glass-walled lobby of Vanguard Technologies, her polished heels clicking with purpose. As she straightened her blazer, she caught her reflection in the glass, alert, eager, and every inch the professional she aspired to be. This job, her new role as an executive assistant at one of the city's top tech firms, felt like the beginning of something monumental. She'd worked so hard to get here, and stepping into this building felt like stepping into her dreams. The receptionist greeted her warmly, handing her a visitor's badge, and directed her to the executive floor. Olivia tried to steady her breath on the elevator ride up, counting the possibilities of her new role. She thought about everything she'd learn, the responsibilities she'd handle, and the opportunities she'd have to grow. For a moment, she felt a flutter of nerves. This was a big step after all. But she quickly brushed it away with excitement. She was here for a reason, and she was ready to prove herself. The elevator doors opened, and she was greeted by a tall, sharply dressed man with a bright, confident smile. His presence immediately filled the space, and Olivia felt a rush of both excitement and nerves. "You must be Olivia," he said, extending his hand. "David Marks, Senior Vice President of Operations. Welcome to Vanguard." "Thank you, Mr. Marks," Olivia replied, shaking his hand firmly. The handshake lasted a second too long, his fingers lingering just enough to make her wonder. She brushed off her brief discomfort, attributing it to the newness of everything around her. David Marks was a highly respected executive, known for his fierce intelligence and leadership, so she couldn't dwell on that odd moment. Today was about making a strong first impression and beginning her new career on the right foot. As David led her through the spacious, modern office, introducing her to team members and explaining company procedures, Olivia soaked in every detail. The space was immaculate, decorated in Vanguard's signature color scheme of cool blues and silvers, with glass walls that allowed for a sense of openness and transparency, a visual representation of the company's commitment to forward-thinking values. Yet, as the day wore on, Olivia noticed things that felt out of place. In casual interactions, employees avoided eye contact with David or adjusted their posture when he entered a room. Some conversations ceased entirely when he approached, and she couldn't help but notice the tension that accompanied his presence. She tried to brush it off as nerves on her part, or perhaps just typical workplace dynamics, but the uneasy feeling lingered at the back of her mind. Determined to focus on her tasks, Olivia spent the rest of her day setting up her workspace, organizing files, and reviewing her responsibilities. She took pride in getting everything in order, eager to show that she was here to work hard and make an impact. By the end of the day, she'd managed to leave a good impression on her colleagues, and her manager had even praised her quick grasp of the job's nuances. As she packed up her things that evening, Olivia felt a sense of accomplishment. She had successfully navigated her first day, learned a lot, and felt excited for what was to come. But when she reached the elevator, waiting to go down to the lobby, a wave of unease settled over her. She couldn't explain it, just a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped in, only to find herself alone with David Marks, who slipped in just before the doors closed. The air felt thick, the once spacious elevator suddenly too small. As the elevator began to descend, David shifted closer, his hand brushing lightly against hers. Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. She quickly moved her hand, subtly pressing herself against the wall to maintain space between them. Her mind raced, but she kept her face neutral, hoping he wouldn't notice her discomfort. David leaned in slightly, his voice low and confident. "You know, Olivia," he murmured, "I could help you go far here. You've got potential." There was something in his tone, something that wasn't quite right. Olivia's instincts were screaming at her to find a polite excuse to leave, to avoid whatever this moment was turning into. But she was frozen, her mind torn between the ambitions that had brought her here and a gnawing discomfort that warned her to tread carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Marks," she managed to say, her voice steady but cool. I'm looking forward to learning and contributing to the team." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, a strange glint in his eye that made her skin prickle. Then, as the elevator reached the ground floor, he straightened up and offered a smile that felt more predatory than professional. "We'll talk soon, Olivia." As the doors slid open and David exited, leaving her alone, Olivia took a deep, shuddering breath. She felt the weight of something heavy settle in her stomach. There was an unspoken message in his words, one that was thick with implications she couldn't ignore. But she pushed it aside, deciding it must have been her nerves, her first-day jitters clouding her judgment. Over the next few weeks, Olivia fell into the rhythm of her new role. She was good at her job, and she received praise from colleagues and her immediate supervisors. She was known for her efficiency and her ability to juggle multiple responsibilities with ease. Yet David's presence loomed over her day-to-day work. He was charming, even charismatic, and Olivia tried to convince herself that maybe she had misunderstood him that day in the elevator. But small things continued to bother her. David would often linger by her desk, watching her in a way that felt uncomfortable, or accidentally brush his hand against hers when passing papers. Once, while discussing a project late one evening, he'd leaned in so close she could feel his breath on her neck. Olivia's heart raced every time she was alone with him, but she felt trapped by her own doubts. Was she imagining things, blowing them out of proportion? After all, David was respected and admired by so many in the company. She considered going to HR, but fear held her back. She was new to the company, still proving herself. What if she was wrong? What if she was overreacting and jeopardizing her career over a misunderstanding? She pushed the thought away, convincing herself she was reading too much into his actions. Then, one evening, as she worked late on a report for an important client, David appeared at her desk. The office was quiet, most employees already gone for the day. Olivia tried to ignore him, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she focused on finishing her work. But David moved closer, resting his hand on the back of her chair, his fingers just inches from her shoulder. "You're really putting in the hours, aren't you?" he said, his tone casual, but his gaze intense. Olivia nodded, forcing a polite smile. She tried to keep her distance, but David's hand moved from the chair to her shoulder, his fingers pressing lightly. "Mr. Marks," she began, shifting uncomfortably. But he interrupted her, his voice a whisper. "You don't need to call me that," he said, his tone suggesting something far more personal. "After all, I can make things easier for you here, if you're interested." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. The room felt stifling, the weight of his words sinking in. She was at a crossroads, and every fiber of her being told her that whatever she said next would define her future. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was her career, her dream job, and she wouldn't let anyone take that from her. "I appreciate the support, Mr. Marks," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm here to work hard and succeed based on my skills and dedication." David's hand lingered for a moment before he withdrew, a small, tight smile on his face. "Of course, Olivia," he said, his tone laced with a warning she couldn't ignore. "But remember, I'm always here if you need me." As he walked away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit office, Olivia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The silent burden. The weeks following Olivia's unsettling encounter with David Marks were a whirlwind of high-stakes projects, long hours, and lingering discomfort. She told herself that focusing on her work was the best way to keep things professional. But no matter how immersed she became, a creeping anxiety followed her. The corporate world was tougher than she'd anticipated. Olivia had always heard of workplace challenges, but she hadn't expected one of them to be her boss. Every time she saw David, she fought to maintain a mask of composure. In meetings, she kept her gaze low, careful to avoid the smirks he shot her way or the occasional winks that made her insides twist with dread. And when she caught sight of him leaning on her desk during late hours or hovering in hallways, She felt her confidence draining. Part of her considered talking to someone about it, but what would she say? She feared she'd sound like she was making something out of nothing. Still, the thought lingered. She'd opened the company policy page on workplace conduct several times, her mouse hovering over HR's contact information, but she always closed the browser window before clicking. She was torn between the knowledge that something was wrong and the fear of being perceived as overreacting. She felt entirely isolated in her situation, battling silent doubts and invisible threats. One evening, as Olivia was filing a stack of reports in the quiet corner of the archive room, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw her colleague Sarah, a soft-spoken woman who had been at Vanguard for nearly 3 years. Sarah was one of the few people Olivia felt truly comfortable with in the office, but they had never spoken beyond polite exchanges. "Hey, Olivia," Sarah said, her voice gentle but strained. "Hi, Sarah," Olivia replied, a little surprised. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the empty room as if worried someone might overhear. "I don't mean to intrude, but I've noticed something." She paused, then took a deep breath. "Are you okay? I mean, are you comfortable working here?" Olivia felt her heart pound. Was she that obvious? She swallowed, forcing a polite smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, getting used to things here. The job, the hours." Sarah didn't respond right away. She simply held Olivia's gaze, her expression understanding yet full of caution. "Listen," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper, "if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, I'm here." Olivia's throat tightened as she read between the lines. She wanted to ask Sarah if she knew something, but fear of judgment held her back. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll remember that," she said, keeping her tone light. But as she watched Sarah walk away, Olivia felt something shift. Her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and strange relief. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe she could find the courage to say something. Later that evening, she went to her usual spot in the cafeteria, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She couldn't shake the tension in her body, and she barely touched her salad, her appetite diminished by stress. A few tables away, she noticed a pair of women talking in low voices, occasionally glancing around the room as though sharing a secret. She couldn't make out much, but one word caught her attention: David. Her ears perked up. She strained to catch pieces of their conversation, heart pounding as fragments reached her. "It's like Jessica all over again," one of the women muttered. "How many people need to go through this before HR does something?" The other woman sighed, a weary frustration evident in her tone. "We all know they won't. They only care about keeping the company's name clean." Olivia's stomach churned as the realization sank in. Jessica. Another woman who had left quietly, almost mysteriously, several months ago. The rumor had been that she moved on to a new opportunity, but now Olivia began to wonder if that was just a convenient story. When she returned to her desk, her mind was racing. She'd spent weeks doubting herself, wrestling with her conscience, feeling that speaking up might end her career before it truly began. But now, the nagging suspicion that she wasn't alone felt more like a certainty. She took out her phone and opened a new note, typing down everything she remembered from each uncomfortable encounter with David. She wrote about the looks, the lingering touches, the subtle yet unmistakable advances. She added dates, details, even direct quotes when she could remember them. The note became a record, a way to track each incident so she couldn't be convinced later that it had all been in her head. After saving the note, Olivia locked her phone, feeling the weight of the truth bearing down on her. She now had a piece of evidence, a record of her experience. But how would she move forward with it? She had no guarantees that HR would take her seriously, and she didn't want to risk retaliation from David. But the idea of doing nothing felt just as impossible. The turning point came one afternoon when David asked Olivia to stay late to work on a sensitive project. The request was normal enough, but her gut twisted at the thought of being alone with him again. She braced herself as he walked into her cubicle that evening. his smile widening when he saw her. "You know, Olivia, your dedication to your job is admirable," he said, his voice smooth. "People notice that kind of commitment, especially people like me." Olivia forced a polite smile, keeping her eyes on her screen. "Thank you, Mr. Marks." "Oh, come on," he said with a smirk, taking a step closer. "We're on a first-name basis by now, aren't we?" She didn't answer, her discomfort mounting as he closed the distance between them, standing so close that she could feel the warmth of his presence. His cologne filled the air, overpowering in the confined space, making her feel trapped. She glanced toward the door, but her cubicle was tucked in the back corner of the office. Everyone else had already left for the day. "Olivia," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have a bright future here. I could help you move up the ladder, if you're interested in that sort of thing." The innuendo was clear. His words felt like a noose tightening around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She realized that this was more than an uncomfortable situation. It was a threat disguised as an offer. "No, thank you, Mr. Marks," she said firmly, keeping her voice steady. David's expression changed, his smile faltering. For a moment, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he recovered quickly, forcing another smile. "Of course," he said, his tone shifting to something darker. "I just wanted to make sure you knew all your options. After all, it's tough to succeed in this field without the right connections." Olivia felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. She was aware that David's influence in the company extended far beyond his title. She had heard enough stories to know that he could make things very difficult for her if he chose to. But she refused to back down, meeting his gaze with a calm defiance. "If that's all, I'd like to finish up and go home," she said. David studied her for a moment, a calculating look in his eyes, before stepping back. "Of course," he replied, his tone laced with something unsettling. "Just remember what I said. You're at the beginning of your career, Olivia. I'd hate for you to make things harder than they need to be." With that, he walked away, leaving her shaken and terrified. Olivia sat frozen, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The full weight of her situation settled over her, pressing down on her chest like a vice. She had stood up to him, but she knew he wouldn't forget this. She was officially on his radar, and the thought filled her with dread. As she finally packed up her things and left the office that night, Olivia felt a profound sense of isolation. The once thrilling opportunity at Vanguard had become a nightmare she couldn't escape. But as she walked to her car, her thoughts turned back to Sarah and the women she had overheard in the cafeteria. She wasn't alone in this. David's behavior wasn't isolated, and there were others who knew what he was capable of. When she got home, Olivia opened her laptop and began drafting an email. She would address it to HR, detailing her experience and formally reporting David's behavior. Her heart pounded as she typed, the risk of retaliation hanging heavy in her mind. But she had reached a breaking point, and she knew that staying silent was no longer an option. After rereading the email 3 times, Olivia hovered over the send button, her mind flooded with fears of what might come next. She thought of her dreams, her career, everything she'd worked for. But as she looked at the email, she realized that this was her only path forward. She couldn't let her fear keep her silent any longer. With a final, shaky breath, she pressed send, her pulse racing as the email vanished into the digital void. She had no idea what the fallout would be, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her life, and whatever happened next, she was prepared to face it. The cost of courage. Olivia sat at her desk the next morning, her nerves frayed as she watched the inbox on her computer. She'd spent a sleepless night replaying the decision to send that email to HR, questioning her choice at every turn. Each time she closed her eyes, she could hear David's words echoing in her mind. "I'd hate for you to make things harder than they need to be." But the email was sent, and there was no going back. Now, as she scanned her inbox, waiting for a reply, Her pulse quickened each time a new email arrived. She couldn't predict what HR's response would be. Would they take her claims seriously, or would they dismiss them outright? She braced herself for the possibility that her courage might be met with indifference or even hostility. Finally, her inbox pinged, and an email appeared from HR's lead representative, Sandra Harris. The subject line was stark and cold. Meeting request. Olivia's heart raced as she opened it. Dear Ms. Wells, please come to my office at 2 p.m. to discuss your recent report. This meeting will be treated with the utmost confidentiality. Sincerely, Sandra Harris, Human Resources. Olivia read the email again, then a third time, searching for any hidden message between the lines. There was no hint of Sandra's attitude, no indication of whether she believed Olivia's account or not. The email was impersonal, clinical. She closed it and leaned back in her chair, feeling a gnawing dread settle over her. The hours crept by slowly, her anticipation mounting with each passing minute. When the clock struck 2, Olivia took a deep breath, gathered her thoughts, and made her way down the corridor to HR. She tried to project confidence, but her palms were sweaty, and her heart pounded as she approached the frosted glass door. Sandra's office was neat and sterile, adorned with a few neutral-colored motivational posters that felt as hollow as her words. Sandra herself sat at her desk, an air of practiced neutrality on her face. She gestured for Olivia to sit down, her expression unreadable. Thank you for coming, Ms. Wells, Sandra began, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. I've reviewed your email. What you've described are serious allegations against a senior member of our team, and I need to ensure we approach this with a full understanding of the situation. Olivia nodded, willing her voice to stay steady. Yes, it is serious. I believe David Marks has repeatedly crossed professional boundaries, and it's created a hostile work environment for me and possibly for others as well. Sandra tilted her head, her expression calm. You mentioned others in your email. Do you have any specific examples, or is this based on assumptions? Olivia's heart sank slightly. Well, I overheard some colleagues mentioning similar behavior. I don't have their stories documented, but I believe there may be a pattern. Sandra sighed, her gaze sharpening. Without concrete evidence from others, it's challenging to substantiate these claims. Vanguard takes complaints of this nature very seriously, but it's essential that we rely on verified information. The way Sandra phrased it made Olivia feel as if she were the one under scrutiny. Her mind whirled as she tried to figure out how to respond. She thought of Sarah, who had offered support in her own cautious way, and the women in the cafeteria, who'd whispered about David in hushed tones. But would they be willing to come forward, or would she face this battle alone? I understand, Ms. Harris, Olivia replied, keeping her voice calm. I'm simply sharing my experiences with the hope that they'll be addressed properly. Sandra nodded, but her expression remained impassive. Thank you, Ms. Wells. We'll look into it and contact you if we need further information. But in the meantime, I advise that you keep this matter confidential. Unverified allegations can have unintended consequences. The weight of Sandra's words settled heavily on Olivia, making her feel as though she had already lost. She forced a smile, nodded, and excused herself, her heart sinking with each step back to her desk. She knew the implications of confidentiality. HR wasn't protecting her. They were protecting the company. For the rest of the day, Olivia felt like she was moving through fog, her mind numb from the subtle yet undeniable betrayal. She'd taken a risk, hoping that HR would act in her best interests, only to be told, in essence, to stay quiet. As she replayed the meeting in her mind, a realization took root in her. She was on her own in this. The following week, the atmosphere around her shifted. Colleagues she'd chatted with daily now avoided her gaze, their smiles tight and forced. Conversations cut off abruptly whenever she entered the room, and even her manager, who'd previously praised her work, had grown distant, barely acknowledging her presence. She'd become the office pariah, marked by whispers and sidelong glances. On Wednesday, her worst fears materialized when she received an unexpected email from her manager requesting a meeting. When she entered his office, his usually warm expression was replaced with a cold professionalism that sent a chill through her. "Olivia," he began, his voice clipped, "it's come to my attention that your recent performance has been lacking." Olivia blinked in shock, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I don't understand. I've met all of my deadlines and exceeded the targets we discussed." Her manager's gaze hardened. "That may be true, but I've received complaints that you've been distracted, and it's impacting team morale. We need everyone here focused and committed." The words struck her like a blow. She wanted to argue, to insist that her work was just as good as it had always been, but she saw the warning in his eyes. She was being punished, not for her performance but for speaking up. Her manager's rebuke wasn't about her work. It was a message from the top, a reminder of where she stood. When she returned to her desk, Olivia felt a growing anger, a rage that she had never felt before. The fear and frustration she'd carried for weeks crystallized into something sharper, a resolve to not let them push her out so easily. She took out her phone and opened the Notes app, adding new entries to her log of incidents. If no one at Vanguard would support her, she would build her own case. That evening, as she packed up her things, she felt a presence behind her and turned to see Sarah standing nearby. The usually reserved woman gave her a quick, sympathetic smile before glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Olivia, I just wanted to say, you're not alone," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "A lot of us have dealt with David's behavior, and we've all had reasons to stay silent. But seeing you stand up to him, it's given me courage." A wave of relief washed over Olivia, even as she felt the gravity of Sarah's words. "Sarah, would you consider maybe saying something to HR?" Sarah's face tightened. "I would, but HR has its loyalties. They already warned me once when I tried to bring up David's behavior last year. It's a pattern here. They'd bury complaints, and the people who make them end up pushed out or labeled as disruptive." Olivia's stomach clenched. Her suspicions had been correct. She was facing a battle against a system built to silence and sideline victims. She looked at Sarah, feeling a spark of determination. "If we could gather more voices, maybe we could make them listen. Would you know anyone else who might be willing to speak up?" Sarah bit her lip, her eyes flicking around the room as if considering the risk. "I can ask around," she said finally, a hint of fear mingled with resolve. "But be careful, Olivia. They won't go down without a fight." As Sarah walked away, Olivia felt a surge of hope. She was no longer isolated. And if there were others like Sarah who were willing to come forward, she might have a chance at exposing the culture of silence that protected people like David. Over the next few days, Olivia began reaching out quietly to colleagues who she suspected had also suffered under David's influence. It was a delicate operation. Each conversation had to be conducted carefully, with an understanding of the risks involved. She met with former interns over coffee, swapped phone numbers with quiet accountants, and sent subtle messages to current employees. Some dismissed her outright, terrified of retaliation, while others listened and nodded, their own silent burdens evident in their wary glances. One evening, Olivia received a message on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. It was a brief, cryptic text, but it contained the glimmer of validation she desperately needed. "Olivia, I know what you're going through. I left Vanguard because of David. If you're serious about this, I'm willing to help." Olivia's fingers trembled as she replied, arranging a time and place to meet. As she typed, she realized that this was no longer just about her. She was part of something larger now, a fight not only for her own dignity, but for the dignity of all those who had been forced into silence. The following day, she met with a woman named Lisa, a former employee from accounting who had left abruptly last year. Lisa recounted her own encounters with David in quiet, measured tones, her voice breaking only once as she described how he cornered her in an empty conference room. Olivia listened, her own anger and sadness mingling with Lisa's pain, and she felt more determined than ever. That night, Olivia assembled all the messages, statements, and her own documentation into a single, well-organized file. She knew that reporting this to HR again might only lead to further isolation and potential retaliation, but she was no longer willing to be silent. This was more than just a report. It was a collection of voices and stories, each one carrying the weight of a painful truth. As she prepared to send the file to a lawyer she'd found through an online network of workplace advocates, Olivia took a deep breath, letting the enormity of the situation settle over her. She had spent weeks trapped by fear and doubt, but now she felt the strength of her purpose. This was the beginning of her fight for justice, and she was ready to face whatever came next. With one final look at the file, Olivia pressed send. A stand against the system. After Olivia sent the file to a workplace rights lawyer, a cold weight settled in her chest. The consequences of her actions felt monumental, but there was no turning back now. She knew that her fight wasn't just against David, but the entire infrastructure at Vanguard, a system that had protected him for years. The next morning, Olivia's inbox flooded with emails. She skimmed through them quickly, her heart racing as she spotted a message from her attorney, Alex Martinez. She had chosen Alex because of their reputation for representing employees in complex workplace harassment cases, and more importantly, for their relentless dedication to justice. Alex had a reputation for taking on cases most other lawyers wouldn't touch, and Olivia hoped that this would be one of them. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the email. Dear Ms. Wells, thank you for trusting me with your case. I've reviewed the documents you provided, and I must say, the evidence you gathered paints a strong picture. That said, taking on Vanguard will be no small feat. They have substantial resources, a powerful legal team, and a deeply ingrained culture that will resist change at all costs. If you're prepared for the long haul, I'm with you. Our first step will be to file a formal complaint with Vanguard's legal department, bypassing HR. This will protect you from any internal interference. However, I must warn you, this will likely intensify the pressure on you from both David and the company. They may retaliate subtly, perhaps even aggressively. Let me know if you're ready for this. If you are, we'll proceed with the first filing. Olivia took a deep breath. Alex's words were sobering, yet reading them filled her with a strange sense of empowerment. She wasn't naive about what lay ahead, but she felt more prepared now than ever. She quickly typed a response, affirming her commitment to the case and her readiness to proceed. Over the following week, Olivia's life transformed into a tightrope walk between courage and fear. Vanguard's response to her actions was swift and unrelenting. The whispers behind her back grew louder, her colleagues kept their distance, and even her manager began assigning her tasks beneath her skill level. She'd gone from being praised as a promising employee to an isolated outsider almost overnight. Then came the ominous email from HR, delivered without any pleasantries. Ms. Wells, please report to the boardroom at 10 a.m. to discuss your recent conduct and its impact on Vanguard's work environment. She knew this wasn't just a meeting. It was an interrogation. When Olivia entered the boardroom, she found herself sitting across from Sandra, her previous HR contact, along with 3 other executives she'd only ever seen in passing. Their expressions were cold and detached, as though she were an intruder in her own workplace. Sandra's face was a mask of professionalism, but Olivia could sense the tension underlying it. Ms. Wells, one of the executives began, his voice devoid of warmth. It's come to our attention that you've been engaging in discussions with various employees about highly sensitive matters. We cannot allow behaviors that disrupt company morale or foster a hostile work environment. Olivia's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to sit up straighter. She'd expected this, prepared herself for it. I haven't disrupted anything. I reported behavior that violates Vanguard's own policies. Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained calm. Regardless, this has created unnecessary strain among your team members and reflects poorly on your commitment to your role here. We're concerned about the effect this is having on productivity. Olivia clenched her hands in her lap. My commitment to my role has never wavered. I've continued to fulfill my duties while facing constant intimidation. Another executive spoke up, his voice sharp. Ms. Wells, we're trying to keep this conversation civil. Let's avoid unnecessary dramatics. Olivia's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her tone steady. I don't consider protecting my right to work in a harassment-free environment to be dramatics. I trusted Vanguard to uphold its policies, and it has failed to do so. The executives exchanged glances, a silent exchange of disapproval passing between them. Sandra leaned forward, her tone suddenly saccharine. Ms. Wells, we're aware that sometimes these situations can be misunderstood. Perhaps we can consider this a learning opportunity, something to grow from. Olivia's jaw clenched as she recognized the patronizing tone, the subtle push to brush things under the rug. They were trying to pacify her, to mold her back into the compliant employee they could control. I understand perfectly, Olivia replied, her voice cold. I understand that Vanguard is more interested in protecting certain individuals than in creating a safe work environment. But I'm not interested in brushing this under the rug. I've retained legal counsel, and we filed a formal complaint. The silence that followed was tense, their eyes widening in a mix of shock and disdain. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Sandra's face hardened. Very well, Ms. Wells, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. You've made your position clear, but I would advise caution moving forward. As Olivia left the boardroom, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had stood her ground, and even though she knew the retaliation would escalate, she felt empowered. There was no backing down now. In the following days, Olivia's life at Vanguard became unbearable. She was assigned menial tasks, cut off from team communications, and ostracized by her colleagues. The friendly office she had once known was gone, replaced by a cold, hostile environment that seemed designed to push her out. But she wasn't alone. Sarah continued to offer her quiet support, leaving messages on sticky notes with words of encouragement. And she wasn't the only one. As word spread of Olivia's stand against David and Vanguard's culture, other employees began to approach her, each with their own stories of intimidation and harassment. Some left her emails detailing incidents they had witnessed. Others pulled her aside in the break room, sharing stories they'd never dared to speak of before. One afternoon, Olivia received a call from a former Vanguard employee, Lisa, who she had met during her initial investigation. Lisa had heard about Olivia's legal filing and wanted to share information she hadn't revealed before. Olivia, Lisa began, her voice low and anxious. I've been sitting on something for months, and I think it could help you. I didn't have the courage to bring it up before, but if you're taking this to court, I can't stay silent anymore. What is it, Lisa? Olivia asked, her pulse quickening. Before I left, I worked with accounting and had access to certain financial records. I stumbled on some irregularities tied to David and a few other executives. They were expensing personal trips, luxury items, even payments to outside parties under the company's accounts. I tried to bring it up quietly, but HR shut me down immediately. I'm not saying it's directly connected to the harassment, but I thought, maybe it could help paint a picture of who these people really are. Olivia's mind raced. This could be the leverage she needed to expose the systemic corruption within Vanguard, to show that David's behavior was only a symptom of a much larger problem. She thanked Lisa and asked if she would be willing to share her findings with Alex. Lisa hesitated. I'm scared, Olivia. I left that place to escape this nightmare. I understand, Olivia replied, her voice soft. But if we do this, we're fighting for everyone who has been mistreated and pushed out. We could make real change, Lisa. You could make a difference. After a long pause, Lisa finally agreed. I'll do it. Send me the details, and I'll work with your lawyer. In the days that followed, Alex worked tirelessly to compile all the evidence, now fortified by Lisa's information. Olivia began to feel a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could bring down the walls of silence and complicity at Vanguard. Then, one evening, she received a message from Alex requesting a meeting. When she arrived at their office, Alex's face was grave but determined. "Olivia," they began, "the evidence we've compiled is strong, but Vanguard is pulling out all the stops. Their legal team has been relentless, trying to discredit you and intimidate witnesses. This is going to be a brutal fight, and I need to know if you're prepared for that." Olivia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew that standing up to Vanguard meant risking her career, her reputation, even her safety. But as she thought of Sarah, Lisa, and the countless others who had suffered in silence, her resolve hardened. "I'm ready, Alex," she replied, her voice steady. "I've come this far, and I'm not stopping now." Alex nodded, a glint of admiration in their eyes. "Then we're going to hit them with everything we've got." The next morning, Olivia woke up to a new reality. Her case against Vanguard was going public. Alex had filed a lawsuit on her behalf, and within hours, news outlets began reporting on the allegations. The headline hit her like a punch. "Vanguard Technologies employee files suit, alleges sexual harassment and workplace intimidation by senior executive." Olivia's phone exploded with messages, calls, and emails. Friends and family reached out, some expressing support, others hesitant, unsure how to respond. But as the day wore on, she received messages from former colleagues, complete strangers, and even women from other companies, all expressing their gratitude, their solidarity, and their admiration for her bravery. For the first time, Olivia felt the true weight of what she was fighting for. This was no longer just her story. It was a call for accountability, a demand for change. The world was watching now, and she intended to make every moment of this battle count. As she prepared herself for the coming storm, Olivia knew one thing with unshakable certainty. She would not be silenced. Not now, not ever. Turning point. Allies, risks, and the gathering storm. The morning light seeped through the blinds of Olivia's apartment, casting long, determined lines across her desk cluttered with files, evidence, and notes. She'd been up since dawn, fueled by adrenaline, poring over the meticulous records of her encounters with David Marks. Every detail, each moment of unwanted attention, every subtle threat and veiled advance was recorded here, stark and unflinching. She glanced at the clock. In just an hour, she would meet with her attorney, Alex Martins, and Robert Chen, Vanguard CFO, who had surprisingly offered his support. Despite Robert's powerful position, Olivia couldn't ignore the vulnerability she had sensed in his message. He, too, had reached a breaking point, admitting in their last conversation that he could no longer stomach the silence or the culture of intimidation that Vanguard's leadership upheld. His courage fortified her resolve. If someone as high-ranking as Robert could stand with her, perhaps this battle wasn't as futile as it sometimes felt. As she arrived at Alex's office, a modest, bustling space filled with stacks of case files and clippings from previous legal battles, she steeled herself for the task ahead. The office walls bore framed photos of Alex with clients from past victories, each a symbol of hard-won justice. Alex welcomed her with a firm handshake, their eyes sharp and focused. Robert, looking more harried than usual, was already seated at the small conference table, his fingers drumming against the tabletop in barely concealed anxiety. "Olivia," he greeted her with a tense nod. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know you must have had second thoughts about trusting me, but I want you to know I'm in this for the right reasons. I can't watch this go on any longer." Olivia returned his nod, appreciating his sincerity but still guarded. "Thank you, Robert. It means a lot to have you here," she replied, her voice steady. Turning to Alex, she took a deep breath. "So, where do we start?" Alex's face softened for a moment before they launched into business. "We need to establish a timeline that shows a pattern of behavior. This needs to go beyond harassment. It's about a culture of neglect and abuse at the top." Robert, if you have access to any internal communications or documents that corroborate Olivia's story, that could be the key to proving the systemic issue here. Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. I've brought a flash drive with several recordings and emails, he said, pulling a small nondescript device from his pocket. I started documenting incidents once I realized HR was turning a blind eye to every complaint. There are discussions about David's tactics and plans for handling employees who complained. Olivia's pulse quickened. This evidence could be the breakthrough they needed. Let's take a look, Alex said, inserting the drive into their laptop. The three of them listened in silence as a series of recorded meetings played. Voices of high-level executives echoed through the small office, their cold detachment shocking even Olivia, who thought she'd already seen the worst of Vanguard. The board members openly mocked complaints, discussing tactics to intimidate or quietly dismiss troublesome employees. David's voice was unmistakable as he joked about his mentorship approach, describing his inappropriate advances with chilling nonchalance. It was a stark and painful confirmation of the corporate rot she had sensed from the start. With each recording, the weight of Olivia's fight grew. This wasn't just about her anymore. These men had built an empire on the back of fear and silence, a structure designed to protect the powerful and crush anyone who dared to speak up. She clenched her fists, feeling anger rise in place of despair. No more, she thought. No more hiding, no more fear. When the recordings ended, a heavy silence filled the room. Robert, Alex finally said, breaking the tension. These recordings are gold. They establish a culture of intimidation and neglect that could bring the entire board to task. With Olivia's documentation, witness accounts, and this new evidence, we have a solid case. Robert let out a slow breath, as if a burden had been lifted from him. I want to help take them down. I've kept quiet for years, telling myself it wasn't my problem. I should have spoken up long ago. You're here now, Olivia replied, giving him a reassuring look. That's what matters. Just as they began discussing logistics for the lawsuit, Alex's assistant entered, holding an envelope. This came in the mail, marked urgent, she said, passing it to Alex. Alex opened the envelope, their expression darkening as they read. It's a cease and desist order from Vanguard's legal team. They're threatening to sue if we don't immediately stop defaming the reputation of David and the company. They claim we're fabricating evidence. Olivia's stomach dropped. It was a scare tactic, one designed to intimidate her into silence. But now, with Alex and Robert by her side, it felt like a last, desperate gasp from Vanguard's executives trying to protect their positions. Alex's expression hardened. They can't stop us from pursuing justice. This cease and desist is nothing more than an attempt to silence us, but we won't back down. Olivia, if you're prepared, we'll file a formal lawsuit. We'll go public with this. The next days were a whirlwind. They worked around the clock, gathering affidavits, organizing the evidence, and preparing for the media attention that would inevitably follow. Olivia reached out to former colleagues who had left Vanguard under dubious circumstances. Some were reluctant to revisit their traumas, but several brave women agreed to stand with her, each adding another layer to the web of evidence. Their accounts, combined with the recorded meetings and email chains Robert provided, painted an irrefutable picture of a hostile environment that protected predators and punished whistleblowers. As they neared the date for filing, Vanguard's tactics grew uglier. Olivia began receiving anonymous threats, her phone ringing late at night with ominous silence on the other end. In one instance, her apartment was broken into, with nothing taken but her laptop and personal documents. It was an obvious message, one designed to shake her resolve. She reported the incident to the police, but it was clear that Vanguard's influence reached beyond the corporate boardroom. She confided in Alex, who reassured her. They're trying to break you, Olivia. It's what they do best. Intimidation, coercion, and manipulation. But don't let them win. The truth is our best weapon. Buoyed by Alex's words, Olivia remained steadfast. She knew the fight wouldn't end until they had exposed the depths of Vanguard's corruption. Finally, the day came. In a press release broadcasted live, Olivia, Alex, and Robert filed the lawsuit against Vanguard Technologies. Media outlets picked up the story immediately, and soon, headlines across the nation bore Olivia's name. She watched the news with a strange mixture of dread and pride. Her story now beyond her control, her image and words circulating on every major network. The public's reaction was swift and intense. Women from all walks of life, from interns to seasoned professionals, reached out in solidarity, sharing their own experiences of harassment and betrayal in corporate environments. The wave of support strengthened Olivia, even as Vanguard's smear campaign attempted to discredit her. The company labeled her vindictive and unstable, launching an internal investigation meant to discredit her credibility. Yet, in the face of overwhelming evidence, the public began to see through their narrative. At the office, Vanguard employees organized an unprecedented walkout, a symbolic stance against the toxic culture Olivia had exposed. Hundreds of workers, clad in Vanguard's blue and gray, stood together holding signs that read, "Believe women and no more silence." The image of the walkout went viral, a stunning show of solidarity that marked a pivotal shift in the industry's attitude toward harassment and accountability. Despite Vanguard's aggressive defense, the strength of the evidence was undeniable. The lawsuit moved forward, each revelation striking a blow to Vanguard's once unassailable reputation. Olivia received messages of support from survivors, organizations, and even other companies promising to adopt new policies against harassment. One evening, after a grueling day of depositions, Olivia sat with Alex and Robert in a quiet moment of reflection. They had spent months fighting, and yet it felt like only the beginning. "Olivia," Robert said, his voice filled with awe, "what you're doing here, it's going to change things, not just for Vanguard, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless in a situation like this." She smiled, the exhaustion giving way to a sense of fulfillment she'd never felt before. "It's about time these walls come down. No one should ever have to go through this alone." As they prepared for the final stages of the trial, Olivia knew that whatever happened next, she had already won in ways that Vanguard's executives could never undo. She had sparked a movement, one that would ripple far beyond Vanguard's walls, ensuring that future generations of employees wouldn't face the same struggles in silence. And with that knowledge, she faced the next phase of her journey with unwavering resolve, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The trial and a movement born. The courthouse loomed large and austere as Olivia Wells stood outside its doors, her pulse thundering in her ears. Cameras flashed from every angle as reporters shouted her name, eager for a statement before the trial began. Olivia took a breath, straightened her blazer, and stepped forward, feeling the weight of so many voices, some silenced, some amplified, behind her. The movement she'd ignited had outgrown her personal struggle with Vanguard Technologies. It was a battle for countless others who had been intimidated, harassed, and forced to carry their pain in silence. Today would mark the beginning of a new era. Alex Martinez stood beside her, their steady presence a comforting anchor. Since filing the lawsuit, Alex had worked tirelessly, preparing the case with an intensity and passion that fueled Olivia's own. Together, they had transformed her trauma into a weapon of truth, a shield against the doubt and fear that had once held her captive. Behind them, Robert Chen, Vanguard's former CFO, joined the ranks of Olivia's allies. His insider knowledge and extensive evidence would be invaluable today. As the doors opened, Olivia cast a final glance at the crowd of supporters who had gathered outside, their faces filled with anticipation and hope. She nodded to Alex, and together, they stepped inside. The courtroom was packed. On one side sat Vanguard's high-powered legal team, faces set with determination and disdain. David Marks was among them, his expression a mixture of contempt and feigned indifference. Olivia could feel his gaze as she took her seat, but she refused to acknowledge him. She had spent too many nights haunted by his voice. his mocking laughter, his veiled threats. Today, she would confront him without fear, and she would do so with the strength of every person who had been harmed by him and by Vanguard's toxic culture. The trial opened with Alex's powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of the systematic abuse and cover-ups that had plagued Vanguard for years. They outlined the evidence, from documented harassment complaints dismissed by HR to the damning recordings Robert had courageously supplied. With each word, the room grew quieter, the weight of Alex's accusations pressing down on the audience like a heavy shroud. When Alex finished, the silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the murmurs of spectators who hadn't realized the extent of Vanguard's corruption until that moment. Olivia took the stand first, recounting her experience with a clarity that surprised even her. She spoke of her first uncomfortable encounter with David, the persistent escalation of his advances, and her disheartening experience with HR, who dismissed her concerns as mere misunderstandings. She detailed the moments she felt trapped, isolated, doubted by her colleagues, and intimidated into silence. The courtroom listened in rapt attention as Olivia's voice, steady, strong, unwavering, exposed the truth she had carried alone for so long. When Alex played the recordings provided by Robert, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from one of disbelief to outrage. The voices of Vanguard's executives echoed through the room, their laughter and casual dismissal of complaints as emotional overreactions and the cost of a fast-paced culture sickening the audience. David's voice rang out clearly as he joked about mentoring female employees, his tone oozing with arrogance and entitlement. Olivia watched as jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging appalled glances, others clenching their fists. The evidence was irrefutable, and it painted a damning picture of the powerful executive who had ruled over his domain with impunity. Throughout the trial, Vanguard's legal team attempted to undermine Olivia's credibility. They presented her as a disgruntled employee with ambitions beyond her capabilities, suggesting she had fabricated the allegations as a means of seeking revenge. They dredged up old performance reviews, emails, and innocuous interactions in a desperate bid to cast doubt on her character. But each time they tried, Alex countered with cold, hard evidence. Emails showing the constant, unwanted advances from David, text messages where he hinted at promotions in exchange for loyalty, and witness testimonies from former employees who corroborated Olivia's claims. One by one, other women came forward to testify. They shared their own harrowing experiences with David and other members of the executive team, recounting moments of harassment and intimidation that mirrored Olivia's. Each testimony added a new layer to the tapestry of abuse, weaving a story of systemic corruption and exploitation that went far beyond a single incident. The sheer volume of accounts exposed a deep-seated rot within Vanguard, one that had festered under a guise of corporate respectability. The courtroom was electric, filled with tension and righteous anger, as each woman found the courage to tell their truth. Robert's testimony became a turning point. As a former executive, he offered insight into the culture Vanguard had cultivated over the years. He spoke of closed-door meetings where executives plotted to silence those who raised complaints, the endless stream of non-disclosure agreements forced upon employees who dared to speak out, and the routine targeting of women who were labeled as troublemakers. His voice shook as he recounted the guilt he carried, the shame of having stood by as others suffered. But today, he was determined to make amends. The trial stretched on for weeks, with Vanguard's legal team desperately trying to control the narrative. They filed motion after motion, seeking to suppress evidence and block testimonies. But Alex was relentless. Olivia watched in awe as Alex dismantled each argument with razor-sharp precision, refusing to let Vanguard escape accountability. Every tactic, every loophole was shut down, and piece by piece, the truth came to light. Finally, after countless hours of testimony, arguments, and damning revelations, the jury retired to deliberate. The days that followed were tense, the weight of anticipation pressing down on Olivia as she waited for the verdict. Reporters hounded her every step, Supporters flooded her inbox with messages of encouragement, and friends rallied around her, offering words of comfort. Yet Olivia could not shake the gnawing fear that, despite everything, justice might elude her. She knew that corporate power was formidable, and money could buy influence, but as she looked back on the journey that had brought her here, she knew that no matter the outcome, she had done all she could. She had spoken her truth, and she had done so for everyone who had ever felt voiceless. At last, the day of the verdict arrived. Olivia sat in the courtroom, Alex beside her, their hands clasped in quiet solidarity. The forewoman of the jury stood, her face solemn, as she read the words that would shape the future for Olivia and for Vanguard Technologies. In the case of Wells v. Vanguard Technologies, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. A murmur swept through the courtroom, a mix of relief and outrage. Olivia felt tears prick at her eyes as the weight of the verdict sank in. She had won. They had won. The jury's decision was followed by the announcement of damages, significant enough to send a resounding message to Vanguard and the industry at large. Justice, at last, had been served. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, many holding signs and chanting Olivia's name. The victory wasn't just hers. It was a beacon for every person who had been harassed, intimidated, or silenced in their workplaces. Cameras flashed as Olivia stood at the top of the courthouse steps, Alex and Robert beside her. In a voice steady with conviction, Olivia addressed the crowd. "This victory is not just for me. It's for every person who has ever been made to feel powerless, who has suffered in silence because they were afraid to speak out. Today, we have shown that change is possible, that justice can prevail. But our work is not over. We must continue to stand up for one another, to support those who cannot yet find their voices, and to demand accountability from those who hold power." Her words were met with cheers, the crowd's support washing over her like a balm. She felt a profound sense of purpose, a realization that her journey did not end here. The courtroom victory had given her a platform, and she intended to use it to its fullest potential. In the months that followed, Olivia threw herself into her new organization, Rise Above. The nonprofit provided legal aid, counseling, and advocacy training for individuals facing workplace harassment. With the lessons she had learned from her own battle, Olivia worked to build an army of allies, people determined to transform their pain into power. Rise Above grew rapidly, its impact spreading across the nation as women and men alike joined the movement to reform corporate culture. Her work caught the attention of industry leaders, lawmakers, and activists who sought her guidance in creating policies that would prevent future abuses. Olivia testified before legislative committees, consulting with companies that wanted to create safer, more inclusive environments. The name Olivia Wells became synonymous with resilience and justice, a rallying cry for those committed to changing the workplace landscape. As she stood before a new group of Rise Above supporters 1 year after the trial, Olivia looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with the hope and determination she had once longed for herself. Her voice carried through the crowd, unwavering as she shared her final message. "We have the power to create change, to rewrite the rules that have governed us for far too long. Today, let us vow to never allow silence to be the price of ambition. Let us pledge to stand together, to rise above, and to demand the respect and safety every person deserves. This is only the beginning." As the crowd erupted in applause, Olivia felt the weight of her journey lift, replaced by a purpose that would carry her forward for years to come. Her fight had been fierce, and the scars it left were deep, but she knew now that her voice, and the voices of so many others, had become a force that could reshape the world.